All right, welcome to the Wednesday, February 27th CNAB developers meeting. As usual, the agenda is located on the HackMD document that is in chat. I think it's in chat. The agenda today was to allow anybody who's, to do introductions for anybody who's new and wants to introduce themselves. Then I think we have a couple of different demos on the schedule. Are the people who are giving demos here, and Nuno is here, so you can kick off with your demo, and then is it Simon Davies or Simone who put this one? Oh, I think they're gone this week, right, Gareth? And then there's a demo of Lupo, which it looks like we're going to bump to the next week. So that'll be the second thing, and then we have several different items on here to discuss, including progress on this spec and some of the other issues that have come up on the spec this week. All right, so if this is your first time and you feel like introducing yourself, go ahead and you can either unmute your microphone and talk, or you can just type a quick sentence in the chat window.
Well, that would be me at least. This is Jason Stevens. I'm with Microsoft. I'm in commercial software engineering, and I own the engineering side of our technical partnership with Pivotal. So I got roped into the CNAB implementation by Boris a month or two ago to work on Cloud Foundry as an early target for CNAB deployment. So I usually work inside Microsoft with Ross Gardler and his cronies.
I recognize everyone else here, but I don't know if anybody else wants to introduce themselves. Otherwise, we can dive into the demo. All right, demo away.
Okay, so actually I will present myself right now. So I will do a dual presentation. So first, I'm Nuno do Carmo. I'm actually here as a hobbyist because I work for a mid-sized pharma company in a totally let's say, IT related. So sorry guys for taking your time. I will just presenting some parts of my discovery as a hobbyist actually. And thank you for granting me the time, of course. So let me just share my screen directly. It will be easier. Before I go into demo mode, I will just put some context. So my idea was to actually build some Windows subsystem for Linux distros more easily than we have today. Today we have like, if I want to go for a custom distro, I will need to go inside the project distro launcher and then know a little bit about C++ if I want to adapt it. So instead of that, after many tries, sorry, I will shorten really, so we'll go to the demo. After so many tries, I learned, or I found out that actually Docker image could be like loaded inside WSL. So sorry for the Docker guys, I'm kind of stealing the images for other purpose than Docker itself. So now, thanks to Porter, so I did some tries with Docker app and Duffel. It was okay, but for the place I am right now, I'm still not inside like what Caroline actually put on, like a CNAB really, or CNAB, sorry, CNAB environment. So right now I'm like building blocks, learning by it, and right now I'm at the exec level that will run actually on the machine directly without going. Let's say I can bundle it, but the bundle will not work. And that's because here, at this stage here, I will call some Docker to build actually images and export them. And then I will call the WSL.exe. So even though I could like remove this part here, the WSL source, and I could run it afterwards, my main challenge right now is like, how could I build let's say images from CNAB directly. So that is a plan, but you will understand why. So here, sorry, I will just start by showing what was created. So we have a bundle. Sorry, we have a bunch of parameters importer. Then I'm calling like the different source. So here is Docker, and then it will be WSL. All that to arrive here, because I'm not in a cnab environment, then I have to set up that the environment variables themselves before I run it. So if I just go here, as you can see here, I have Alpine. So first, if I just go check what I have W Linux, sorry, a bit of publicity here, but W Linux, and then I have the normal Ubuntu from the store. But now if I run directly what I have here, then now it will create the container, like the basic, and then it will like export it. I took Alpine because it's really small and it will fit during the demo time. So now if I redo that, I have now an Alpine, and I can just simply connect to it and done. So here, so we have a WSL release, or distro as you call it, directly done like that. And of course, because I'm a kind of maniac, I also created the uninstall, and then I don't have it anymore. So that is the part, like it's built on the Windows 10 Insider, the latest Insider, because we have all these commands that were put lately that allow us to actually import, export, and the tar files actually. So the ID now, it's a bit of like a how do you say, a small surprise, or even for me. The goal here is like, okay, building Windows 10 WSL is great, but the main point below or behind the scenes is like, we have WSL, sorry, I will just hide this one now. We have WSL on servers also that can be loaded. And as you can see here, so here we have a lot of documentation, and that's quite easy to do. But again, it's based on a distro that is not custom. So once you create your custom distro, let's say on Windows 10, and now you want to maybe populate it somehow through the servers. So here I have just a VM running the latest also Windows Server 1809, but Insider version. So if I can just run just a screen fetch here quickly. I preloaded, the only thing that I did here is like I preloaded Ubuntu because I will need it. And that's something that it went back and forth with Jeremy actually in Caroline about how I'm using Porter. And because I'm not into a cnab, I need still a Linux base user mode at least to be running my scripts. And here, sorry. So here, what I did is like I just have again a Porter YAML. I think yes. Okay. So this one is shorter even. So this one I'm just setting some variables quickly, and let's say that potentially the distro image here now is on your own registry of let's say Azure or Docker Hub, for example. So we could call directly the image that we, let's say, created, and then now, or let's say cnab it in a sense. So that's the next challenge, as I said. And here, so once we created the image, now I can simply do something. So I will just do two things just to show you quickly the gain actually in time. So here I will pass first I will download Debian for the normal way, let's say the Microsoft validated way, okay? So, and while I will be doing that, I will be just doing, I prepared, of course, sorry, demo time, oops. So I need still to export my variables again, because I'm not into this cnab. And then here, actually, I'll just type it, Porter, oops, run Oops, sorry, Swiss keyboards. Action install, and then file. I will use the porter. And while I'm still downloading here Debian, I'm actually now this time installing Debian also, again in a sort of cnab way, downloading it from Docker Hub, and then it will normally arrive in a few minutes. Yeah. So here is creating the container, and then finally it will like import it. And the way that here after the download of the file itself, we need to follow still some steps about like how to create your user and how to potentially again configure the WSL distro. And okay, I think that's it for me. So that was just the gaining time, as we can see, like it's yeah, that was just that easy. So thanks to cnab now, like I said, the goal will be like to cnab it for real, just to create my my distro images that I can store in a registry, and then as WSL exec cannot run or cannot live within a cnab that I can get. So what I would like to do is like to just take this command out, and but all the rest, the creation at least of the images based on maybe a Docker file that we could have, then it will be into the cnab bundle. So that will be for the the next weeks, I guess, during my hobby time. Thank you.
There are all these use cases that you come up with when you're trying to create a project. This was nowhere near any of the use cases I had ever imagined seeing cnab used for. So this is amazing. That was a lot of fun to watch.
So I have only one question, just so that it's clear for everyone. So essentially, you're using the cnab way of passing parameters and the porter way of bundling everything up, but you're not executing things inside invocation image, but directly on the machine running porter. Is that correct? Is that
exactly? And that's what we found out with Caroline. Actually, that was just lucky. That was my tweet of the day. Like, I didn't know that it was impossible, so I did it. The thing, it was like I was always all the time on WSL. So that's where I live. And then because I was running Porter, it was calling correctly all the mixins and all the execs actually, and the Porter itself. So it was calling everything correctly. So when I was preparing, especially the server side demo, it was like, okay, let me do it with actually PowerShell, and it was just simply not loading. It was failing, and then okay, Caroline fixed the bug, and then I tried it again. It was still failing, and then she said like, okay, but you are outside the cnab, and the mixin should run inside cnab. And then that's when I realized that contexts, right? So if I split the context, then the context of WSL is like, okay, it's a Linux, so I can run like if I was inside the context itself. So my context here is the machine, totally, yes. And that's why I said like the next step will be to enter the cnab context to create actually the image, to let's say configure it in a sense, and then reuse the cnab just to pull it actually on the machines that I want to install my WSL, and I would have like the image, or let's say the full bundle, but then I will not be able to call WSL.exe, I guess. So that's where, again, you're totally right. I'm using cnab tools outside cnab context.
And this actually poses an interesting question based on some other discussions I've had with people, whether it would be valuable for people to have the option of running things not inside an invocation image, but inside directly on the operating system. And if that's something that's valuable, I think it's worth the discussion of having an extension to the spec of allowing to do so and standardizing the way we allow things to do. Because if you know the environment where you're going to run, and if you make sure that you have all the dependencies locally, you could potentially execute things inside directly on the operating system and not on in an invocation image. And it's curious to me if there's other use cases that people might see where this is valuable.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Rocket, the runtime, used to let you choose to execute things locally, and I wonder if we could just write a Rocket driver that would be able to unbundle an OCI image and execute it locally without even having to change the. So you can essentially run a Docker image locally. I don't know. It's an idea.
Yeah, it
kind of comes up to.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Radu.
I was only going to say that if you have use cases that might be close to this, it would be great if you spoke up in Slack. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a couple other, whether it be we've been thinking about CNAB as remotely executing things on locally as a pretty key package, or adding some new binary. The fact that I can bootstrap it as well, and it kind of comes back to some of the packaging we've been discussing of should the things that I'm actually deploying be in the Docker image, or the Docker image is a way to have the runtime, but the things that the artifact that I'm actually using to deploy are in the quote bundle, but they're not actually in the Docker image that is the invocation image. Like, I think I've always thought of invocation image as the thing that I invoke and can run things, but I didn't necessarily think the artifact that I would run would be in the invocation image so that you can do things like this.
All right, well, that's a thread we should keep open because there could be some interesting things in there. Okay, so Josh, who was here, did officially pass to next week. And who was the third person who said they might do a demo? Oh, Simone, who's out today. Okay. I think we'll close off with the tooling request for help thing. That was what we had discussed doing last week. Jeremy, do you want to? You have one on there that's release notes and summary of spec changes, and there's also the core 1.0 progress.
Yeah, you might answer it with the core 1.0 progress. Carolyn and I discussed last week about changes happening to the spec, and as tooling authors, it would be nice if there was like a summary, or we're not doing release notes yet, obviously, because it's not finalized. But if we had like a reoccurring weekly summary of like the things that had changed that week, it would be easier for people that were implementing tooling to follow along. I was just curious if there were any plans to stabilize the spec soon so we could move to more like release notes kind of status, or if not, I'll volunteer to make a summary of the weekly PRs that go into the spec.
Okay, that's a good question. The current plan of record was to have the CNAB core spec relatively solid by the end of this week. And that's part of the reason why we've been merging a lot over the last week. So this week, a lot has changed in the spec. But I, for one, think that would be a great idea to just run, even if we just ran a changelog printout over the Git repo and dropped it in the weekly minutes, that would probably be helpful to people to figure out what changed. To kind of summarize what's been going on the spec, because I know there's been a lot of work going on from a lot of different people this week. So we wanted to get the core, so we wanted to kind of divide up the specification so that we could focus a lot of attention on what we're calling the CNAB core spec, and then move some of the other ones out to other specifications. So as of today, there are 4 specifications living inside of the spec repo. One is called CNAB core and describes the bundle.json, the general architecture, the layout of the image, and the requirements on the runtime. And we are working on one last piece for that, which is a description of what the exported format needs to be. That'll be the CNAB core spec in total. So then the second one is the CNAB registry spec, which has like a placeholder paragraph in there right now, but it doesn't have much more. I think we'll probably circle back to that next week when Chris is back, because they've been experimenting with some stuff. The third one is the CNAB security spec, and that's the one. So we've removed all the OpenPGP stuff from the core spec, and in the new security spec, it's discussing using TUF, which is an alternative to the way we were doing things, and in toto, which adds a different attestation and validation model for export import. So those are kind of, there's a skeleton of that out there. It's like 5 pages, but it's not terribly detailed at this point. So that'll continue progressing independently as well. And then the fourth spec is the claims spec, which was moved out of the core, and the core was kind of rewritten to not reference claims anymore. So claims are their own specification at this point. Then several other smaller things that were sort of non-normative got moved out into the 800 section, which is where we put all of our non-normative stuff. So there have been minor changes implemented there. So with all of that said, the idea is that if we can get the CNAB core spec really ironed out, nailed down, what's the right metaphor? If we can get the CNAB core spec basically finished, then that means CNAB runtimes can do a couple of rounds of updates, and then we can all be on something that we feel pretty confident about. And that is our current goal. So once we get it relatively, so the idea is that we can get all the breaking changes out of the way right away. And then if we need to keep doing some more additive changes during the working draft phase, that would be okay. But we've been playing fast and loose with the breaking changes, and the JSON schema has been changed multiple times over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And the reason why was because we figured if we could just do all the breaking changes in one big concerted effort, then that opens up the opportunity for all the different teams on here who are all using CNAB for various things to kind of solidify their code base. Does that make sense?
It's a question about the structure of the spec. Can implementations pick and choose which specs they implement, or is the core mandatory if you pick the other chapters?
The core would be mandatory for CNAB compatibility. You probably wouldn't be able to implement all of the security one without some of the registry one. But the idea was core was the main thing we would want people to be able to say we're CNAB core compatible and mean we can work with the CNAB format, and all the rest would basically be optional and implemented depending on what the needs are of the runtime.
Okay, so it's a base with some towers.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor.
Yeah, a picture would be nice, but a description would do.
Yeah, so I've got lengthy bits of text at the beginning of each one saying, this one presupposes the core spec, but does not, the core spec doesn't, but yeah, a nice diagram would be good.
Great, thanks.
So on that note, we're still hoping to have the major ones done by the end of this week. There are a couple of outstanding PRs that are almost ready to merge. I'm just waiting for the original submitters to okay that they feel all right with merging it. And then there are a couple that are still open where we're still trying to discuss it. The standard in one, which we'll talk later, is an additive change. So I don't feel like we have to have that done by the end of the week. Same with some of the deeper JSON schema integration, because that's additive, I think. And then then Glenn had talked about possibly making image data from an exported, and then when you run over an exported image, being able to access the image data from within the invocation image. And I've been thinking about that a lot, and I think that could be an additive change too. I don't think that'd be a breaking one, but I have to, maybe if we have time at the end, we can do an ad hoc conversation on that, Glenn, because I'm very curious about what the use case is and if we can do it without breaking any other core assumptions. So I think that's where we are on the spec progress. Jeremy, do you think we ought to start the running of release notes maybe next week?
Yeah, I'll volunteer to do that too.
Okay, anybody else want to comment on any of that stuff before we move on to the next item?
Just a quick question on the status of image drivers. Are they in or out? I can't tell from reading the spec.
Drivers are not, so the spec doesn't say anything about the image formats except some kind of non-normative stuff about the Docker format of referencing an image versus a VM image. but so the drivers are part of the Duffel implementation right now, and there is no spec. We could write a spec on it, but I don't know how general use, how useful that would be for general use, and I'd love to hear input.
Okay, thank you.
Gareth, do you know if Docker app does support drivers or is intending to support drivers?
I think for our use case, where I'm only really interested at the moment in the Docker bits for obvious reasons. I'm pretty sure that we're actually using the Duffel, like basically using Duffel as a library to do that at this point. So I think we'll like, if things are there, like we'd probably end up with them. Whether we then expose an actual user interface to them, I think is probably not something that we're super interested in at the moment.
Yeah. And I know of a team that tried building an M6 MSIX driver, and I think they had some success. Is anybody else trying to use the driver setup and would be interested in trying to formalize some of that?
So we started a discussion about allowing people to write plugins for drivers, and essentially, if anyone else is interested in that discussion, we'd like to pair up and understand some requirements for the information that would need to be passed from the Duffel to a specific driver in order for the driver to build images and invocation images. So we hope to have that discussion up and running in the next week, we hope.
Is Porter likely to support drivers? Or is it basically going to support whatever Duffel does since it imports some of the libraries?
It's likely to use whatever Duffel does after we do some refactoring to support using that stuff more directly from Porter.
Okay, anything else on that one? All right. Next item on the agenda was to talk about passing data over standard in as another input. Ravashi, were you the one who wrote that one? I'm trying to remember who wrote that issue.
Ryan and I.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do either of you want to give an update on kind of what your thinking is on that one? We've had a lot of discussions, but they've been kind of haphazard on my side.
Yeah, I think like where the discussion is currently headed is like the parameter inputs are for envars and files, and maybe a compromise to this proposal would be to include parameter inputs as standard in as well. I think there's still some discussion around, I guess like our main point was to have objects and arrays be one of the supported parameter input types, and that's a little bit unclear when it comes to envars and files, how those would be serialized. So the intent with having them be standard in is that there is a path forward with that. But I guess it really boils down to like what are the use cases for bundles in particular. If we imagine, you know, kind of like the use cases that we have is that we do want to be able to parse these parameter inputs, do some validations on them, check if they're the right kind, and then have those be injected. But that sounds like it may not necessarily be the common use cases for bundle authors. So yeah, curious to hear what people are thinking.
And as I had looked at it, so there were two issues that are related in some ways, but could be treated separately, right? One is just the passing data over standard in addition to being able to pass on environment or file. And maybe if we want to talk about that one just really quickly, that would be good because we can probably put that one to rest really. Is anybody opposed to being able to pass data directly into the run tool on standard in? And I think the suggestion that Ryan had made was that the syntax would be something like, you know, string standard in : true as the inside of the destinations object. I think that sounds fine with me. There's no, I was trying to think if there's any other alternative to standard in that was standard in like we want to pass data to, like in a pipe or something, but all of that just seemed like way over architecting what we needed to be able to do.
I think the where the option of choosing standard in as like a way to pass in data and the then choice of a structured data format like JSON, it becomes intermingled is when you ask the question of, if I have two parameters and both of them declare standard in true, what is the actual content of standard in? If I'm the run tool and I read standard in, what am I reading in? If it's not structured, how do I differentiate between the two parameters that actually declared standard in true? Does the specification say you can declare standard in true, but only on one parameter in the entire set of parameters? Like what are the semantics around that particular choice is really the thing that kind of blocks all of it. It's like, yes, you could put stuff on standard in, but like how technically is that actually achieved?
Yeah, and that is a good point, because I've seen uses like log streaming where multiple JSON objects are sent into it, and the parser on the other side just knows to parse them. But on the flip side, if we did it, kind of the way we do environment variables, your standard in could just look like, an unstructured character stream, which would probably not be useful. Yeah, we should, if people have definite feelings about how to do that, now would be a good time to bring it up. But if otherwise, we can keep going on that one in the issue related to it.
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to say is the choice of JSON is like an arbitrary choice of a structured format. Like, I don't think there's anything specific about that particular data format that we care about, just that there is like structure, that it's parsable. So I'd be interested in like other folks' interest in like anything really, just something that enables that functionality.
So on this, that's a good segue into the second part of the issue, which was, so right now parameters can be specified as basically primitive types, right? Int strings or numeric strings, Boolean, stuff like that. And then we've started using the JSON schema format recently to perform validation against the values. So we've been having several discussions that are at least related, if not the same, about whether we could allow someone to declare an array or object or something like that as a parameter type, and then pass structured data in and have the JSON schema validate the structured data in the CNAB runtime, and then somehow pass that JSON object into the invocation image as a file or envar or now standard in data, right? Did I summarize that correctly?
Yeah, in our case, like we're talking about configuration options that would be things like imagining that for some particular use case, you have to provide an unbounded list of, say, addresses, in which case you're combining the concept of like an array and objects, right? The address might have like a street number or a street name and a house number and a zip code, and like these arbitrarily named things that then also are then compounded by the unbounded list of things. So that's kind of a silly example, but like that's a possible case that we're looking to cover. And so where it stands today is like if you only use the existing types that we have within the spec, then we really are having to define our own spec on top of that spec in order to like get this structured data into our CNAB invocation image. And our preference would be that that's like supported so that the bundle JSON itself is complete in terms of being able to say this is a complete specification of all the inputs. So however we can arrive at that kind of result, like that's the thing we're most interested in.
Okay. Tabling for one moment the problem of environment variable encoding. How do you feel about the idea of just allowing the embedding of a JSON schema in a parameter definition that would describe what that structure looked like, and then validating CNAB runtime side, and then injecting that in as a file or standard in data or whatever? Does that solve the original use case?
Yeah, I think that the proposal, correct me if I'm wrong, but you did propose this on the issue, that this is like an addition of a schema field that includes this kind of like place where you can put then JSON schema definition that describes the actual parameter. Yes, I think that would cover that for us. I think then it also became this kind of question of, our expectation, I mean, the things we're planning on shipping as CNAB bundles are like relatively large distributed systems with like lots of configuration and like large configuration settings. So then we started running into like issues of like, well, both from like a standpoint of like the limitations of environment variables, like in terms of the amount of data you can actually jam into them. And then also like security limitations of like, we'd rather not write everybody's credentials to files, even inside of a container. What are the options we had, which is why we chose standard in. Then it became a question of like, okay, if we do this and say this is for on a per parameter basis, then we're back to that question of what if multiple parameters within the bundle specify standard in true, and what does that structure look like? So all this stuff's kind of like intermingled, but I think that like, yes, we would like to see something on standard in, and yes, we would like to be able to declare a schema for JSON, for like arbitrarily structured JSON data. Yes, on both counts. We just want to like, you know, make it a cohesive experience.
Right. Okay. All right. So if we continue on through the issue queue on that stuff, we're at least, the main thing I wanted to know is if it's always sometimes hard to gauge on written text if we're making progress in the right direction or if I'm basically completely misunderstanding what you're after. So if you feel like we're moving in at least the right general direction, we can just keep going on the issue queue with that.
Yes, I feel like we've made progress. I'm just trying to like get more clarity on some of the like particulars, and I think that we're making progress in that direction. So thanks.
All right. Any other comments on that one, or should we move on to the next item? All right. Silence means moving on. Radu, you added an item discussing documentation. You want to kick that one off?
Yeah, so the item is about self-contained documentation, and a bit of a background on that. If you take Docker images, the main issue with documenting Docker images is that you get the image itself in a container registry, and then you have information on how to use the image either in a README of the container registry, or you have to go to a Git repo to actually have a look at the documentation. So there's no way for someone who just pulled a container image to know how to use it without going to some other place to see and search for that, for where the place is for the documentation. And it would be an interesting experience if you could have, if someone has a bundle, to also have the information on how to use it. And now the question comes of, is a description or a documentation field in bundle JSON enough of a documentation for a bundle? And if not, how else would we standardize a place for documentation files, README files, either inside the invocation image, or have, as other proposal was, to have a custom action predefined for documentation, or reserve a folder in the invocation image itself. And I would just, first of all, would like to understand people's thoughts about self-contained documentation and whether it's a good idea to have a specific field in the bundle, and then about directories inside the invocation image. And I know both Garrett and Butcher had some ideas about that.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts. I think documentation as first class thing is definitely a plus one for me. It's definitely a good idea. It's come up in a couple of conversations around images over the years, before I was at Docker and since. I linked to a post recently by Luke Perkins, who laid out a load of good reasons for first class documentation. I think all of them apply here. I had a conversation with him at KubeCon as well. In the context of the work we did on the label schema stuff for Docker images, and that led to some of the OCI images, one of the things there when it came to the question of documentation, and was, I honestly in there we were talking about a label, but it's ultimately the same as a field in the bundle.json. A description in there, like a user-friendly description, is necessary but not sufficient. It's not the same as documentation. And trying to cram a field could only really have a single page of documentation, and that would quickly become the majority of content in that file. That's not metadata, it's content. One approach is reference, i.e. you include a URL, you include a link to something. I think that's nice, but on the other hand, that's not self-contained. And I think the self-contained part is actually like one of the things with cnab that is most interesting, like the ability, at least the ability for it to be wholly self-contained, wholly. So I'm a fan of having a way of doing that. A well-known label leaves it as an implementation detail for anyone to do what they want, which I think could be referenced or could be included, and that could be a good thing. The alternative, I think, would really just be saying, actually, there's a reserved part of the file system, and that's where things go. And at that point, you need, I think, from a tool point of view, all you really need is if there are, you need an acknowledgement of what extensions mean in that context, and you need a good entry point. So README, basically README files on GitHub are the perfect example of this. They're treated as entry points. It's not that that's special in any way, but it's been made special by GitHub, and I think that gives you a sort of a known entry point. Index.html is exactly the same. It's a known entry point. So if we want to do something, if we think it's worth having something in, like actually in the spec about the contents, I think that's the route. You could just do it at the known action point and then leave it as an implementation detail for like bundle builders. There's then more like not every like is that required? Is that not required? Comes up. It's basically where does the work want to get done? I think it's sort of interesting.
So
yeah, I think that both are plausible, but like one of them would be a good idea in my view.
Have you guys thought about whether it's like the scenarios come to mind of, I do want to read it in the in Docker Hub on the registry listing, as well as when I have the bundle, regardless of where I got it from, I want to be able to get the docs as well. So I assume those are the two scenarios that we would do, because putting images up at MCR, for instance, what we have is when we cleaned it up, we had a bunch of people that on their README it had a link that pointed to their GitHub, because they didn't want to maintain the docs in two places, which was a frustrating experience because before you knew whether you even liked this image, you had to click somewhere else. So being able to extract the content to be able to show in your registry display to know whether this is even the bundle I want in the first place, in addition to the fact that I should have that exact same content without somebody have to do a separate action, that every time they update that content, when I get the bundle, I don't have to go back to the registry to see that information as well. Yeah. So one of the thoughts I was kind of thinking as you were describing this, is links and so forth and content in a folder, couldn't this just be another layer that is another artifact type of docs that applies to images, it applies to cnabs, it applies to a Helm chart, and then the registry could know that artifact type and say, oh, I'm just going to display that, and the cnab manifest could also bring down that layer, and it really is nothing more than a collection of markdown files.
Yeah, at the implementation of it in the OCI context, like that would make a lot of sense. And again, like from the Metadata spec point of view, it's that file system. How that file system is broken down into layers is a detail of the OCI bit, but that would make I was thinking about it from the point of view of registries having a known thing. The disadvantage of the action approach is that in order to get access to the documentation, the registry would need to actually run the action, and that's versus access a file system. And yeah, basically, if that file system is actually part of a separate layer and that layer has metadata, that's even easier from the registry point of view. So that might be a good reason for actually having the specifying the file system at the spec level, and then in the OCI bit specifying and that file system exists on a separate layer.
But it wouldn't. It just knows how to persist that piece. Sorry. Go ahead, Radu.
So the current implementation would be we reserve a directory on the invocation image, and then the tool responsible for pushing to the registry reads that and creates a special layer of documentation that registries would read separately?
What I'm suggesting is it's not actually in the invocation image. It's actually something that's in the cnab. Like if you take the cnab extraction, once it's extracted, it is a directory. And then what I think Gareth is saying is, when it's persisted, the tool knows how to take that doc directory and stick it as a layer, so that the registry could pull it out. Because right now, all of the registries, we all implement various metadata services that there's no standard on. There's been some light attempts, but nobody's really made a great attempt. So like for ACR, we store the description, the title, and the README, all of that content in a metadata attribute, so we can actually parse it really easily. We haven't first classed that experience yet, but the problem is that's unique to us. And part of what we're trying to do here is it shouldn't be unique to ACR. It should be a common thing. So it just, having it as a separate layer just seems like a great way for the registries to pull it out in a well-known way, because we would just say that is the artifact type in OCI, and the bundle could pull it down, and then it's just a bunch of markdown files on, how you guys decide the README, .md is the entry point or indexed in HTML. That's obviously what you guys can decide how you want to do it.
Yeah. We'd have to have an analogous story for the export-import scenario as well.
Yeah, and how does that translate for a thin bundle, where the only thing that gets stored in the OCI is the bundle JSON file?
Well, I think it goes back to the registry conversations. Even in a thin bundle, I assume the invocation image is still a reference. So you would still have pointers to it. So this would be a pointer to a doc. And I assume docs are optional. So somebody could choose, the doc is, just a layer that maybe you even decide that there's an optimization that says, when I bring this bundle down, I don't bring down docs. I don't know how big that will be to be something worries about. Like for instance, in NuGet, there's an option for bringing NuGet packages down, and you don't bring down the XML comments. And that turns out to be a huge time saving because there's lots of packages. But that's an extreme example of this.
And it's worth separating the layers part, which is the optimization in the context of OCI for registries. I think it's a good one. It's worth separating that from the user part of, actually in that file system hierarchy there is a reserved folder for docs, and basically that's where the things go. How that actually ends up as layers in a OCI image is those two things are separate, at least in my mind.
Yeah, and that shouldn't concern the bundle JSON specification.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so in terms of the change to the spec, so in the discussion of we want to finalize the spec, the main changes to the spec by the end of this week, adding documentation would mean adding the description field in bundle JSON and adding a reference that we have a reserved directory inside the invocation image, which will be used by things that push and pull to registries in their own way. But go ahead.
I'd say that if this is how we approach it, the addition of docs here is optional and additive. So again, let's not. I think stabilizing things is fine, but this is net new. And we don't need to. There's nothing. The only people who are going to implement this are us. So there's not a rush here for it to be the spec done type thing. I think we can definitely write this down. We should try and implement it. It might be horribly wrong, but we don't need to. I think we don't need to decouple those two things. I think ultimately the problem of documentation being first class is good. The idea of that making that first class in registries is also beneficial. Having support in the relevant tools that people are building for documentation of first class things sounds really good.
Yeah, I think it would be trivial to just add a PR that says, in addition to all the what are the 3 reserved directories right now, we could just add doc as a reserved directory to prevent anybody from assuming that they could use it for whatever they wanted. and call it good for the core spec. Most of what we just talked about would go in the CNAB registry spec, which is currently 2 sentences long, so and not part of the core thing. So we could definitely pick that up in the coming weeks.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and what Steve Lasker just said in chat is a good point. If it's an optional part, an additive. Yeah. Okay. Now I think I closed the tab that had the agenda. I think the last thing for the agenda was just a time for anybody to bring up what they're working on, and if they need any help or would like any eyeballs on code to help with anything or clarify anything. So I'll open it up for that right now while I try and go find the tab that I closed. All right, and Glenn, if you don't mind, if you have a moment to describe the use case that would require reading images from inside the, reading exported images from inside the invocation image, then we can keep going on that one in the issue queue if you have a moment to describe that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's not essential. There are other ways of doing it, but I was trying to avoid complicating the runtime and the spec by having that function in there. But the basic use case is that we've got a product that includes a fair number of images from Kubernetes and the Knative project, and then some images of our own. And we have to ship that, but some of our customers want to install that product in an air-gapped environment with a private registry. And so we take those images, what we do today is we pack them into a tar file inside the distribution, and then the customer unpacks that and then can relocate those images to point at their private registry and push them up. And then we edit the YAML files, the Kubernetes YAML files, to point at those relocated images. And they've got digests on, so there's kind of safety about getting the right things and so on. So then they can run in their air-gapped environment and pull down the images from their private registry, and all is good. So we're wondering how to do that in the CNAB world. That's the basic issue. And my kind of bias is towards keeping the spec simple and putting any bells and whistles like this in the invocation image, and particularly in a base image, so that the spec doesn't really need to worry. So in that world, we probably have a parameter passed in that the spec doesn't, it's not special in any way, it's just a parameter saying what the target registry is. And then the base invocation image could handle relocation, but it needs to load the images in order to push them to the registry. So it needs access to the binary images. The alternative is, we've been discussing in some of the issues, is for the runtime to give some assistance there and do the pushing, but then provide a map of old image name to new image name and somehow pass that into the invocation image to say, this is what I did, now fix up your YAML files to match that. And either of those is a workable solution, but I'm trying to make it simple for the spec, as it were. And just, for instance, just mounting an area where the binary images from the bundle were present seemed like straightforward. And it might satisfy the use cases as well. You've got all sorts of binary stuff in your bundle. Just make it available to the invocation image at a mount point, and job done. But maybe that opens up too many holes. Maybe there are other issues that I haven't thought of. Is that clear?
Yeah, that was very clear. This is actually a method that I had never even considered before, the one you just described. I had been so fixated on the method we were pursuing that I'd never thought of this as an alternative. So just hearing you describe it is great. Michelle, I know you've been working on the import-export. Did you want to explain any of how it currently works, or we can actually table some of that till next week and tackle stuff in the issue queue if you prefer.
Yeah, I can answer your question, Glenn, in the Slack channel and kind of explain how import-export has been working. We did go down a path where we could have helped with pushing the images. Jeremy was working on what was the command you were working on? Rebuild, or started with an R? Oh, rewrite. Yeah, rewrite command. I'm not sure what we ended up not going that route because we wanted to not manage the images, right? The referenced images, Jeremy. So we were first on this path where we wanted to like handle all the referenced images too alongside the indication image, but then we kind of pivoted and decided that that's not something that would be out of scope of CNAB. But this use case sounds like really interesting, and I think that we could do. I think there's a lot of interesting modifications we can do to import export to kind of help with the use case that you just described. But I'll continue. I can answer the questions in Slack and then also continue on that thread that you were commenting on yesterday.
Okay, great.
And Chris, were you trying to say something too? I didn't mean to cut you off there. All right. Okay, we're at the top of the hour. Again, thank you everybody for coming. Thanks for all the activity on the issue queue this week. It's been a busy week for us, and it's been really great. I feel like we're making the progress we need to, and the sheer diversity of use cases that are coming in here is really, this is why we wanted to get started on this, release everything in the open before anything was even close to done, because hearing all these stories changes the way we're thinking about it. So thank you very much for your patience and willingness to engage often repeatedly to try and explain use cases and offer solutions and in general, PR and help out. Thank you very much. So until next week, we will see you all later.
Okay, bye-bye.